The F-15 Eagle is one of the most recognizable military aircraft in United States history, and it has a long and cherished service record. But there was also one occasion where, logically, you would have expected a loss to take place, and yet the F-15 in question was still able to return to the airfield safely, despite the fact that it was missing a wing. What? How? Let's talk about it. Hello, welcome to another episode of History in the Dark. I am your host, Darkness the Curse. And before we begin, as always, thank you so much to my generous patrons, my British rail critics, and of course my underwater train finders. You are the reason why this content remains a one-winged angel. And today, we are going to discuss that time an F-15 landed without a wing. Because apparently that's a thing that aircraft can do, which really shouldn't be possible. And yet, it is! Before we get to the actual incident, let's just discuss the F-15 in brief. I could do a whole documentary about the F-15's development, but I'll give you the cliff notes. The F-15 was designed and constructed by McDonnell Douglas, first flying on the 27th of July, 1972, over 51 years ago. They are still in service now, and have a bunch of different variants, and are considered one of the most successful fighters in history. They have over 100 combat victories, suffering no losses in aerial combat. The majority of those kills are with the Israeli Air Force, who we'll get to in a second. The origins of the F-15 can actually be traced back to the Vietnam War, due to disagreements between the US Air Force and US Navy. No changes there then. The Defense Secretary at the time, Robert McNamara, was pressing both service branches to use as many common aircraft as possible to lower costs, even if performance compromises were involved, which is really annoying for both sides of the coin here, because both the Navy and the Air Force had vastly different requirements for their aircraft because they did different things with them. They embarked on the TFX program, which became the F-111, and while the F-111 did turn out to be a decent plane in the end, it also kind of showed why sharing aircraft between the two services was a pain in the butt. Developing the F-111 to make both the Air Force and the Navy happy was a technical nightmare. And in the end, the Navy wound up just backing out because the 111 couldn't do what they wanted it to do. The Air Force did eventually utilize it, however. The Navy then went their own way and accepted a proposal from Grumman, which became the F-14 Tomcat much later. But for the Air Force's side, they weren't really thrilled with the F-111 either, and in January of 1965, McNamara had asked the Air Force to consider a new low-cost tactical fighter design for short-range roles and close air support, to replace several older planes, like the F-100 Super Sabre. Several existing designs could fit that role, but in April of that year, Harold Brown, who was the director of the Department of Defense Research and Engineering, stated that the favored position was to consider the Northrop F-5, while at the same time begin studies of what was known then as an FX. Early on, the plan for this particular plane was to be a multi-role aircraft, able to handle both aerial engagements as well as ground attack roles. However, that focus shifted quite a bit to air superiority upon the revelation that the Soviet Union had created the MiG-25 in 1967. The 25 was designed as a high-speed, high-altitude interceptor aircraft, and frankly, they weren't very good because they had to make a ton of performance trade-offs to actually do what they did. They were blindingly fast, but at what cost, comrades? It was a lot of cost, as it turns out. But the US didn't know that. When they first saw pictures of the thing, all they saw were fairly large wings, similar to their own FX studies, and they assumed it would offer high maneuverability, and they therefore thought the Soviets were suddenly outclassing United States aircraft, which they just could not stand. They were also worried about the MiG-23, which was believed to outclass the F-4. Eventually, they finally decided to go with the air superiority route. McDonnell Douglas eventually won the contract, and the result was the F-15. The F-15 actually had some early criticism due to how large they were, as some believed they could never be a proper air superiority fighter, and they'd be too expensive to procure in large numbers. Those criticisms were actually replied to, and the US Air Force had General Dynamics create the F-16, and both planes served alongside each other for many, many, many years. The F-15, like I said, is still in service, as the plane proved its critics horrifically wrong in almost every conceivable way. The F-15 was a violent success, outrageously so. A top-tier air superiority fighter, it had many, many different variants, and was eventually evolved into the F-15 Strike Eagle, which readapted that original idea of a multi-role plane, much more specialized for ground attack as well. The F-15 was supposed to be replaced by the 2010s with the Lockheed Martin F-22, but the 22 wound up being violently expensive to procure, and the Air Force decided to reduce how many they were actually going to buy, meaning they would keep the F-15 C and D variants around for quite a bit, at least until the decade we are currently in. The F-15E, the Strike Eagle, is supposed to continue operating till at least the 2030s, and unlike the 22, the F-15 was allowed to be exported to various countries. Currently, it's in use by Japan, the Royal Saudi Air Force, as well as the Israeli Air Force, and that is where our story begins. It was May 1st, 1983, during an Israeli Air Force dissimilar air combat training session over the Negev, or the Negev, which is a desert and semi-desert region of southern Israel. Dissimilar Air Combat Training, or DACT, was introduced as a formal part of US air combat training after disappointing aerial combat exchange rates in the Vietnam War. Now, the actual training that was done was relatively the same as it always had been, but with the major difference being that the aircraft involved would be very different in terms of type and role. What had been happening is that pilots just weren't used to facing off against aircraft that they really had never seen before, ever, or anything really close to them. They always trained against similar aircraft to the ones they were using, sometimes the same ones, and that meant that they weren't accustomed to aircraft with vastly different technical capabilities, because even if those aircraft were on paper inferior, they might be able to do something the pilots wouldn't expect. Fly obnoxiously slow, for example, or turn way tighter than the pilots would think they would be able to. DACT did assist when it came to pilot training, and Israel also decided to adopt the practice. The training session involved, again, an F-15, a D model specifically. She actually has a name, Markia Shakim, which translates to Sky Blazer. That is awesome. And her registration number is 957. The other aircraft that was involved was an A-4 Skyhawk, a single-seat subsonic carrier-capable light attack aircraft that also originated from the United States. The F-15 was piloted by Zevi Nadivi and had a navigator, Yahor Gal, in the rear seat. And during the training session, the two aircraft accidentally collided with each other, which, as you might imagine, was really bad. The A-4 quickly began to disintegrate, though fortunately, that plane was equipped with an automatic ejection seat in the event of a catastrophic failure, and the pilot was safely thrown out of the plane before it completely broke apart, and he would survive. But in Markia's case, well, her right wing had been, well, sheared off, almost completely, roughly 2 feet, 60 centimeters, from the root. She really might as well have had no wing at that point. And the real frustrating part about this was that Nadivi knew something horrible was wrong because he lost control of the plane, but fuel was leaking horribly and vaporizing at the wing attachment, which obscured both his and Gal's view of that side of the aircraft. They actually couldn't see how bad the damage was. They just knew that they were starting to roll. The instructor ordered an ejection, but Nadivi outranked him. So he overruled that decision, being incredibly stubborn, and attempted to save the plane by engaging the afterburner. This, incredibly, worked. By increasing the plane's speed, he was able to stabilize her, and they quickly diverted to Ramon Air Base, where he was forced to land the plane at twice the normal speed, because he had to keep up a much higher rate of speed to maintain lift. He did this successfully, bringing the aircraft to a stop just 20 feet, 6 meters, from the end of the runway. It wasn't until he actually got out and looked at his plane and he realized how bad the damage was, he would later say that if he had known just how much of a wing he didn't have, he wouldn't have attempted what he had done, because him, like everybody else, took one look at the plane and said, there's no way this thing can fly, and yet she did. But how? Even McDonnell Douglas was a little confused by this, and they went on to do their own analysis. But they figured out how this had worked pretty quickly, because they had built the thing. See, the F-15 was designed with a very, very wide lifting body. It doesn't necessarily include the wings. Basically, part of the plane's fuselage also provides lift, so if you can fly fast enough, and the F-15 is known to have a violent excess of thrust, technically, you don't actually need the wings. You become kind of like a rocket. It's not something that they would necessarily recommend, but it is something the F-15 can obviously do. After the incident, the aircraft was taken to an IAF maintenance unit at Tel Nof, where she was actually repaired, and that particular aircraft was already credited with 4 kills during the 1982 Lebanon War. She would go on to be credited with another kill of a Syrian MiG-23 on November 19th, 1985. And the most recent picture I can find of her is actually back in 2011. She may still be around, though I can't find concrete proof of that. But, hey, absolute legend over here. Negev would go on to be interviewed many, many times regarding the incident. And like I said, he repeatedly maintained that he would not have attempted it if he had actually known he was missing a wing. He didn't know that. So, he attempted it, and it worked. So, hey, no complaints around. It's just a crazy thing. But I guess at the end of the day, it goes to show 2 things. Negev was a very good pilot, full marks to him, but also, man, the F-15's a great plane. I mean, seriously, I love these things. They don't even need wings. They just own the sky. And with that, a special thank you to all my underwater train finders, SomeDude267, Orange Glass, Benjamin Owens, Panzer Kitsune 131-232, Josh Johnson, Metal for Life Guy, Anzac A1, Arthur Roy, Tommy Rossini, Lord Captain Von Thrust III, Joshua Long, Brian, Jack Carson's Roro Videos, Hayden Negro, Master of None, Lord Hoth 444, The Baxter, The Guy with the Beard, Mark Holding, Murder Drone Stall, A-Person 723, DM Trouble Typhoon, Alfonso Lapuche, Royal Hudson 2860, Isurfer 1405, Charles Kwiatkowski, Matthew Wolf, Ohio Trucker 1, Mr. Sleepy, Matt Weaver, Alderic Jaspers, Tom Redlion, NS Productions 8104, Hannah Bird, Hendrick Motorsports Fan 5, Wheeljack 8401, and Rescues Greyhounds. Till next time, this is Darkness, and I bid you all a fond farewell.